for Contemporary Arab Studies. And on behalf of my colleagues at the Center, I welcome you to the 2011 Karima Khouri Annual Distinguished Lecture. This lecture series is funded by an endowment that was made by Ms. Karima Khouri to the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies in 1986. Karima Khouri was born, raised, and educated in Beirut, Lebanon. She was one of 8 children and immigrated with 5 of her siblings to the United States. One brother was an Air Corps pilot who died in action in World War II. And while she never married or had children of her own, Karima was always extremely generous to her members of the family and supported one Lebanese nephew throughout his education in the United States. From 1948 to 1967, Karima Khouri worked at the Library of Congress and at the CIA as a translator, and I wish to welcome personally the members of her family who are or may be in the audience tonight. The Karima Khouri Lecture is a signet event in our annual public affairs program. It enriches and enlivens our academic corps by allowing us to host and recognize the achievements of our most distinguished colleagues in the field of Middle East and North Africa studies. And the Center is extremely grateful for this opportunity, especially at this pivotal moment in Arab history. And in this regard, we are extremely privileged to be able to welcome one of the most insightful and engaging scholars in our field of studies. Professor Timothy Mitchell specializes in the political economy of the Middle East and North Africa. He examines the political role of economics, of expert knowledge, the politics of large-scale technical systems, and the place of colonialism in the making of modernity. He was educated at Queen's College, Cambridge, where he received first-class honors degree in history. He completed his PhD in politics and Near Eastern studies at Princeton University in 1984 and joined Columbia University in 2008 after teaching for 25 years at New York University, where he served as director of the Center for Near Eastern Studies. And as all you surely know, Professor Mitchell is the author of Colonizing Egypt, which is a study of the emergence of the modern state in the colonial period and an exploration of the forms of reason, power, and knowledge that have defined the experience of modernity. The book, Colonizing Egypt, has been influential in several fields, ranging from anthropology, history, law, philosophy, to cultural studies and art history. Translations have appeared or are in preparation in 7 languages, including Arabic, German, Polish, Spanish, and Japanese. Further writings by Professor Mitchell on the nature of European modernity include an edited volume entitled Questions of Modernity, which brings together the work of leading scholars of South Asia and the Middle East. In the field of political economy, he has published a number of essays on agrarian transformation, economic reform, and the politics of development, mostly drawing on his continuing research in Egypt. The research includes long-term fieldwork in a village in southern Egypt, which he has studied and written about for more than a decade. His 2002 book, Rule of Experts, Egypt, Technopolitics, Modernity, draws on his work in Egypt to examine the creation of economic knowledge and the making of the economy, in quotation marks, and the market, in quotation marks, as objects of 20th century politics. He also studies in this book the wider role of expert knowledge in the formation of the contemporary state, the relationship between law, private property, and violence in this process, and the problems with explaining contemporary politics in terms of globalization or the development of capitalism. His current research, about which we will be hearing tonight, brings together the fields of postcolonial theory and science and technology studies in a project on carbon democracy, which examines the history of fossil fuels and the possibilities for democratic politics that were expanded or closed down in the construction of modern energy networks. And this work will in fact be published next week in a book by Verso Press, so I know I'll be looking forward to having that in hand soon. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm really so happy to be able to say, please join me in welcoming our 2011 Karima Khouri Distinguished Lecturer, Professor Timothy Mitchell.
Thanks very much to Professor Abi Mershad and to the Centre for this invitation to be here this evening. It's a great pleasure and a great honour, and to see, as I look around, so many old friends in the audience makes it an even more special pleasure. The relationship between fossil fuels and democracy could be summarised simply as follows. Coal created the possibility of modern democracy, and oil its limits. To understand the limits, I'm going to first outline what made the emergence of a certain kind of democracy possible, the kind I'm going to call, that I call in this new book, carbon democracy. But before turning to the past, let me mention some of the contemporary limits I've got in mind. In the decades since the attacks of 9/11, one of those limits was widely discussed. A distinctive feature of the Middle East, it's often said, has been its lack of democracy. Many people think this has something to do with oil. Countries that depend upon petroleum resources for a large part of their earnings tend to be less democratic. The uprisings that spread across the Arab world over the last year appear to confirm this relationship between large oil earnings and the difficulty of mounting claims for a more democratic and egalitarian life. Drawing a map of the Middle East and color-coding the countries by oil revenues gives you a map of the Arab Spring. There would be 3 colors, one marking the 4 countries with no oil, one distinguishing the 8 that produce a lot of oil, and one showing the 5 that fall in between, each producing a small amount of oil, and each the production of oil recently rapidly declining. Those 5, Tunisia, Egypt, Bahrain, Yemen, and Syria, are the countries in popular revolt. Libya, the smallest of the 8 large producers, but where, unlike the other 7 of that group, production of oil had also suffered a recent decline, falls neatly between the 2 categories, both in its economic challenges before 2011 and in the course of its political revolution. Those who write about the question of the oil curse, as it's sometimes called, usually have little to say about the nature of oil and how it's produced, distributed, and used. They discuss not the oil, but the oil money, the income that accrues after petroleum is converted into government revenue and private wealth. The reasons they offer for the anti-democratic properties of petroleum focus on this excess revenue. It gives governments the resources to repress dissent, to buy political support, or relieve pressures for more equal sharing of prosperity. The explanations have nothing to do with the ways in which oil is extracted, processed, shipped, consumed, the powers of oil as a concentrated source of energy, or the apparatus that turns this energy into forms of affluence and power. They treat the oil curse as an affliction only of the governments that depend on its income, not of the processes by which a wider world obtains the energy that drives its material and nickel life. Ignoring the apparatus of oil production reflects an underlying conception of democracy. This is the conception shared by an American expert on democracy sent to southern Iraq 9 months after the 2003 US invasion to discuss capacity building with the members of a provincial council. "Welcome to your new democracy," he said, as he began displaying PowerPoint slides of the administrative structure the Americans had come to build. "I have met you before. I have met you in Cambodia. I have met you in Russia. I have met you in Nigeria." At which point, we're told, 2 members of the council walked out. For an expert on democracy, democratic politics is fundamentally the same everywhere. It consists of a set of procedures and political forms that are to be reproduced in every successful instance of democratization in one variant or another, as though democracy occurs only as a carbon copy of itself. Democracy is based on a model, an original idea that can be copied from one place to the next. If it fails, as it seems to in many oil states, the reason must be that some part of the model is missing or malfunctioning. An idea is something that somehow is the same in different places, that can be repeated from one context to another, freeing itself from local histories, circumstances, and material arrangements, becoming abstract, a concept. An expert in democracy or in democratic transitions, perhaps today, has to make democracy into an abstraction, something that can move easily from place to place, so that he can carry it in his suitcase or his PowerPoint presentation, from Russia to Cambodia, from Nigeria to Iraq, from Tunisia to Egypt, showing people how it works. Once one's made democracy into something that moves around the world as an idea in order to move with it, one is committed to a particular way of explaining how the idea works, how people become democratic. If democracy is an idea, then countries become democratic by the idea getting into people's heads. The problem of democracy becomes a question of how to manufacture a new model of citizen, one whose mind is committed to the idea of democracy. A central theme in discussions of the Middle East and the United States, not just now, but over the last decade or more, has been this question of how to manufacture new kinds of citizen. In debates about the war in Iraq, economic reform, the future of Palestine, political Islam, obstacles to democratization, the spread of anti-Americanism, the current uprisings, one finds a recurrent interest in the question of how to produce a new kind of political agent. How can one create subjects of power who are adequately equipped to impose limits on authority? How does one form a citizenry that refuses to authorize authoritarianism? What kinds of education, enlightenment, training, or experience are required to engender forms of economy based on agents who act according to their rational self-interest rather than corruption or cronyism? What produces forms of politics based on mutual trust and respect for opponents rather than suspicion and repression? In short, these kinds of debates ask, how can people learn to recognize themselves and respond as subjects of new forms of power? What forms of power, conversely, can engineer the liberal or democratic political subject? There's been plenty of criticism of the way these questions have been posed and answered, especially in debates about democratization, often faulting them for ignoring the so-called larger forces at work. American writings on the problem of democracy in the Middle East typically have little to say about capitalist globalization, the work being done to turn people into docile workers or willing consumers required to solve economic crises in the West, about forces of empire or free market for whom democratization schemes are a minor diplomatic part of wider efforts to shore up a weakening hegemony, or about the tools of violence and repression that occupying powers, army regimes, and interim military juntas deploy. Such criticisms, however, overlook something interesting in these debates, the notion that democracy is an engineering project concerned with the manufacture of new political subjects and with subjecting people to new ways of being governed. Take a recent example of research on democratization in the Middle East that may be familiar to some of you, the Arab Barometer Project. The project has been carrying out opinion surveys in 5 Arab countries in order to measure the presence of individual attitudes and orientations that might be conducive to the establishment of democracies. These orientations include, quote, political tolerance, respect for diversity, civic engagement, and interpersonal trust. The project was funded by the Middle East Partnership Initiative of the State Department and governed by a board that includes scholars from each of the countries whose political culture the project seeks to measure and to record. The project forms part of a wider initiative called the Global Barometer, which carries out similar research in other parts of the world. The Arab version, along with a number of similar surveys of the region, has published results of opinion surveys that claim to put in question many of the prevailing assumptions in official circles in the United States about political attitudes in the Arab world. It can be connected with other recent State Department initiatives, such as the Democracy 2.0 project, which organized workshops in New York and elsewhere, sponsored by Facebook, Inc., to bring together activists from the Middle East and other countries of the South as part of a program to combat jihadism by creating a culture of interactive exchange. Whatever the usefulness of showing us some of the limits of older official discourses about Arab democracy, the Barometer Project seems at first sight to suffer from a weakness that affects much of the research on questions of democratization and civil society. It appears to be looking for what one might call democracy without democratization. The premise of the project is that, quote, successful democratization requires a citizenry that values democracy and possesses the elements of a democratic political culture, unquote. By the same token, the State Department supported Facebook activism because social networking, State Department officials argued, created a user-generated world, Internet 2.0, in contrast to the centrally produced content of the old Internet 1.0. Facebook and similar devices create a shared, interactive, liberal online community, it was thought, which might provide an alternative, Washington argued, to the more authoritarian structures of earlier internet relationships. There's no reliable evidence, as far as I'm aware, that the presence of a shared liberal culture, attitudes of trust, tolerance, mutual respect, and other liberal virtues facilitates the emergence of democracy, or that the exchange of ideas among a particular community is the means to its emancipation. There is, in fact, no shortage of historical evidence to suggest the opposite. One can find repeated examples in the history of democratic struggles in the West of tolerant, educated, well-networked liberal political classes who were opponents of democratization, fighting to prevent the extension of effective political rights to those who did not own property, to religious and racial minorities, to women, and to colonial subjects. In many cases, the civic virtues and facility with communication that dominant political classes possessed provided the grounds on which to oppose democratization. Their own civility, reasonableness, and ability to network and communicate, they often claimed, qualified them to act as spokespersons for the interests of those who were not yet ready to speak for themselves. Once democratic rights had been achieved, their exercise may encourage the development of virtuous civic attitudes, at least among members of an expanded political class, virtues whose inculcation and practice become a mode through which people subject themselves to democratic authority. Democratization, on the other hand, has often been a battle against those attitudes. It has required a more intransigent set of engagements and practices. This book of mine, Carbon Democracy, is concerned with those more intransigent engagements and with the ways in which carbon energy help manufacture forms of agency capable of effective intransigence. I began writing the book because I wanted a better understanding of the relations between democracy and oil. Initially, like everyone else, I thought of oil as one thing and democracy as another, and wanted to make better sense of why one seemed to be bad for the other. But after following how the oil industry was built in the Middle East, as I traced the ways in which people had explored for oil, built pipelines and terminals, transformed the petroleum into forms of heat energy and transportation, converted the income from those processes into profits, and sought ways to circulate and govern those flows of money, it became increasingly clear to me that carbon energy and modern democratic politics were tied intricately together. Rather than the study of democracy and oil, it became a book about democracy as oil, as a form of politics whose mechanisms on multiple levels involve the processes of producing and using carbon energy. When studies of oil and democracy confine their attention to the problem of oil money, the income from oil and its corrupting powers, rather than starting with the process through which oil is produced and distributed, they are unconsciously imitating the way energy networks were first built. In 1914, when Royal Dutch Shell began producing oil in Venezuela, the country's dictator, General Gomez, asked the company to build its refinery offshore on the Dutch island of Curaçao. He wanted the money from oil, but he didn't want the large concentration of workers and accompanying labor demands that a refinery would bring. A decade later, when the company now known as BP began building an oil industry in Iraq, it planned a pipeline to carry the oil across neighboring countries to the Mediterranean, from where most of the oil would be shipped to refineries in Europe, stretching out the thin line of oil production over an even greater distance. When a nationalist government later requested that BP and its allies build a modern refinery in Iraq, the company vigorously opposed the demand. In other words, if oil appears to affect the producer states largely after its transformation into flows of money, that appearance was produced in the building of pipelines, the placing of refineries, the negotiation of royalties, and other arrangements that from the start, in their effort to evade the demands of an organized labor force, were connected with the question of carbon democracy. The transformation of oil into large and unaccountable government incomes is not a cause of the problem of democracy in oil, but the outcome of particular ways of engineering political relations out of flows of energy. Failing to follow the production and circulation of oil itself, accounts of the oil curse diagnose it as a malady located within only one set of nodes of the networks through which oil flows and is converted into energy, profits, and political power, in the decision-making organs of the individual producer states. This diagnosis involves isolating the symptoms found in producing states that are not found in non-oil states. But what if democracy is not just an idea, a culture? And democracies are not carbon copies but carbon-based? What if they are tied, indeed, in specific ways to the history of carbon fuels? Can we follow the carbon itself, the oil, so as to connect the problems afflicting oil-producing states to other limits of carbon democracy? The leading industrialized countries are also, of course, oil states. Without the energy they derive from oil, their current forms of political and economic life would not exist. Their citizens have developed ways of eating, traveling, housing themselves, and consuming other goods and services that require very large amounts of energy from oil and other fossil fuels. These ways of life are not sustainable, and they now face the twin crises that is going to end them. First, new discoveries of oil are unable to keep pace with the exhaustion of existing supplies. The flow of oil from existing fields now in production is declining so fast, oil companies have to bring online about 3 million barrels a day of new production every year just to keep up. That's the equivalent of discovering and developing a new Saudi Arabia every 3 to 4 years. Although estimating reserves of fossil fuels is a politico-technical process involving rival methods and forms of calculation, it appears that we are about to enter an era of declining supplies. The Earth's stores of fossil fuels will not be exhausted. As coal and oil become more scarce and the difficulty in extracting them increases the cost and the expenditure of energy their extraction requires, this will bring the era of fossil fuels to an end with consequences that we cannot know. The Earth's stock of this, quote, capital bequeathed to mankind by other living beings, as Jean-Paul Sartre once described it, will be consumed in a remarkably short period. In the case of oil, the fossil fuel that was the easiest to extract but has now become the most difficult to increase in supply, more than half the total consumed in the 150 years between the 1860s, when the modern petroleum industry began, and today, more than half of that was burned in the 3 decades since 1980. From the perspective of human history, the era of fossil fuels now appears as a very brief interlude. The second crisis, of course, is that in using up these sources of energy, as the US President's Science Advisory Committee warned almost half a century ago in 1965, humankind has, quote, been unwittingly conducting a vast geophysical experiment, unquote. By burning within a few generations the fossil fuels that had accumulated in the Earth over the previous 500 million years or so, humanity was injecting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that by the year 2000, they said, was expected to increase the concentration of atmospheric CO2 by 25%. Quote, this may be sufficient to produce measurable and perhaps marked changes in climate, the 1965 report had warned, adding that these changes could be, quote, deleterious from the point of view of human beings. The experiment proceeded much more rapidly than the President's science advisors expected. Levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere have now increased not by 25 but by 40% since the start of the industrial age, with half that increase happening, as with the production of oil, within just the last 3 decades. The consequent changes in the Earth's climate threaten to become not just deleterious from the human point of view, but catastrophic on a planetary scale. A larger limit that oil represents for democracy is that the political machinery that emerged to govern the age of fossil fuels, partly as a product of those forms of energy, may be incapable of addressing the events that will end it. Now, following the carbon doesn't mean replacing the idealist schemes of the democracy experts with a materialist account, or tracing political outcomes back to the forms of energy that determine them, as though the powers of carbon were transmitted unchanged from the oil well or coalface to the hands of those who control the state. The carbon itself must be transformed, beginning with the work done by those who bring it out of the ground. The transformations involve establishing connections and building alliances, which do not respect any divide between material and ideal, economic and political, natural and social, human and non-human, or violence and its representation. The connections make it possible to translate one form of power into another. Understanding how using fossil fuels enabled or restricted democratic claims requires tracing how these connections are built, the vulnerabilities they create, and the narrow points of passage where control is particularly effective. Political possibilities were opened up or narrowed down by different ways of organizing the flow and concentration of energy, and these possibilities were enhanced or limited by arrangements of people, finance, expertise, and violence that were assembled in relation to the distribution and control of energy. Like energy from fossil fuels, democratic politics is a rather recent phenomenon. The development of the two kinds of power has been interwoven from the start. Let me briefly outline the way they were co-assembled, starting with coal and the rise of mass politics in Europe and America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It's long been understood that the rise of coal, made possible by the use of steam power to access seams of carbon deep underground, allowed the development of large-scale manufacturing in the modern city, and that out of mines, factories, and urban life emerged the forces that struggled for democracy. But these political forces have usually been thought of one-sidedly as social movements. Gathering in workplaces, labor unions, political clubs, it's said, people forged a political consciousness with which they fought for more egalitarian and democratic collective lives. The account is one-sided because it leaves out the equipment with which this political agency was assembled and ignores the technical vulnerability to which oligarchic forms of rule were now, in certain parts of the world, exposed. The socio-technical worlds built with the vast new energy from coal were vulnerable in a particular way and at particular sites. And it was the movement of concentrated stores of carbon energy that provided the means for assembling effective political challenges. Large stores of high-quality coal were discovered. Industrial regions were built above or adjacent to those supplies of coal. Coal was so concentrated in carbon content that it became cost-effective to transport energy overland or on waterways across somewhat greater distances than had happened with timber or other renewable fuel supplies. The development of steam transport, whose original function was to serve coal mining, and which in turn was fueled by coal, facilitated the movement. By the end of the 19th century, industrialized regions had built networks that moved concentrated carbon stores from the underground coalface to the surface, to railways, to ports, cities, and to sites of manufacturing and electrical power generation. Earlier sources of energy, firewood, animal power, water mills, food crops, human labor, were based on solar power. Converting solar radiation required very large areas of land set aside for woodland, pasture, cultivation, rivers. Energy was very widely available, but very thinly distributed. It was laborious to harness it, but difficult to widely interrupt its supply. With the switch to coal, vastly greater quantities of energy now flowed along much narrower channels. Large numbers of workers had to be concentrated at the junctions where these channels met or branched. Their position and concentration gave them at certain moments a new kind of political power. The power derived not just from the organizations they formed, the ideas they began to share, or the political alliances they built, but from the extraordinary concentrations of carbon energy whose flow they could now slow down, divert, or cut off. Coal miners played the leading role in contesting working regimes and the powers of employers in the labor activism and political mobilization of the 1880s onwards. The unrest was concentrated not in manufacturing, but in the interconnected industries of coal mining, railways, dock workers, and shipping. The great unrest in Britain, for example, on the eve of World War I, typified the threat of a new kind of action, the political act now known as the General Strike, in which a triple alliance of mine workers, dockers, and railwaymen exercised the power to shut down energy nodes. The dispersed energy systems of solar radiation had never allowed groups of workers this kind of power. The strikes were not always successful, but the new vulnerability experienced by the owners of mines, railways, and docks, together with the steel mills and other large manufacturing enterprises dependent on coal, had its effects. For the period of a few decades, either side of World War I, labor movements could threaten a country's energy networks and thereby bring the productive life of an entire country to a halt. This threat impelled the oligarchs of the old liberal orders into accepting the forms of welfare democracy and universal suffrage that would weaken working class mobilization. After the Second World War, oil workers at an oil refinery in Michigan launched a strike that spread across the American oil industry and into automobile and other manufacturing, and became the largest wave of strikes in American history. In response, corporatist America developed a new model of democratic politics in which labor was limited to bargaining over pay and working conditions, which would improve only with increases in productivity, themselves related to ever-increasing uses of energy. Workers would have no democratic role in the governing of the workplace, and there would be no wider redistribution of ownership or wealth. US planners then worked to export this corporatist model to Europe through the Marshall Plan, and to engineer the West's post-war political order. The coal miners and their political allies in Europe now appeared to American planners as the core of a militant threat opposed this new corporatist order. Washington responded with a new mechanism to defeat them, to convert Europe's energy system from one based on coal to one based predominantly on oil. Scarce supplies of steel and construction equipment were shipped from the US to the Persian Gulf to build a pipeline from eastern Saudi Arabia to the Mediterranean to enable a rapid increase in oil supplies to Europe. The diversion of steel and of Marshall Plan funds for the purpose of oil consumption, it was the largest single expenditure of Marshall Plan funds, was justified in part by the need to undermine the political power of Europe's coal miners. Now, like coal, oil gave workers new kinds of political power. Decisive industrial action was organized at Baku in 1905 in the Russian-controlled Caucasus, giving rise to the First Russian Revolution, in the Maracaibo Strike of 1922 in Venezuela, in 1937 in Mexico, in 1945-46 in Iran, and later in Saudi Arabia. However, the material qualities of oil made things different from coal. Since it comes to the surface driven by underground pressure, oil required a smaller workforce than coal in relation to the quantity of energy produced. Workers remained on the surface under continuous supervision and surveillance. Since the carbon occurs in liquid form, pumping stations and pipelines could replace railways as the main means for transporting energy from the site of production to the places where it was used or shipped abroad. Pipelines were vulnerable, as I'll mention, but not as easy to incapacitate through strike actions as were the railways that carried coal. For the same reasons, oil could be easily shipped in large quantities across oceans, whereas historically very little coal crossed oceans. Compared to moving coal by rail, moving oil by sea eliminated the labor of coal heavers and stokers, and thus the organized power of workers to withdraw their labor from a critical point in the energy system. Ocean shipping operated beyond the territorial spaces governed by the labor regulations and democratic rights won in the era of widespread coal and railway strikes. In fact, shipping companies could escape the regulation of labor laws altogether, as well as the payment of taxes, by resorting to flags of convenience, removing whatever limited powers of labor organizing might have been left. Unlike railways, ocean shipping was not constrained by the need to run on a network of purpose-built tracks. Oil tankers frequently left port without knowing their final destination. They'd steam to a waypoint and receive a destination determined by the level of demand in different regions. This flexibility carried risks. It was the cause of the first giant oil spill, the Torrey Canyon disaster in 1967. But it further weakened the powers of local forces that tried to control sites of energy production. If a labor strike, for example, or the nationalization of an industry, as in Iran in 1951, affected production at one site, oil tankers could be quickly rerouted to supply oil from alternative sites. In other words, whereas the movement of coal tended to follow dendritic networks with branches at each end, but a single main channel like a tree, creating potential choke points at several junctures, oil followed along networks that often had the properties of a grid, like an electrical grid or a computer network, where there is more than one possible path and the flow of energy can switch to avoid blockages or overcome breakdowns. These changes in the way forms of fossil energy were extracted, transported, and used made energy networks less vulnerable to the political claims of those whose labor kept them running. At the same time, the fluidity and flexibility of oil presented new problems for those who owned or managed the production sites and distribution networks. It was no longer sufficient to control production and distribution in just one region, as with coal. Since oil could move easily from one region to another, petroleum companies were always vulnerable to the arrival of cheaper oil from elsewhere. This vulnerability, seldom recognized in accounts of the history of the oil industry, set further limits to the democratizing potential of petroleum. Market competition destroyed profits, ruined companies. It had to be prevented at all costs. The difficulty of transporting coal across oceans meant that coal producers faced competition only within their own region. They prevented it by forming cartels or other methods. Oil companies faced similar threats, but on a transoceanic scale. The two world wars helped restrict the supply and movement of oil. But between the wars, a new set of devices was developed to limit the production and distribution of energy, including government quotas in the United States, consortium agreements to delay the development of new oil industries in the Middle East, and cartel arrangements to govern the worldwide distribution and sale of oil. These techniques and controls shaped the development of the Transnational Oil Corporation, which emerged as a peculiar long-distance machinery for maintaining limits to the supply of oil. After World War II, new devices were added to this machinery for the production of scarcity, for keeping oil scarce enough. There were two important techniques for transforming a post-war carbon energy abundance into a system of limited supplies. The first was the new apparatus of peacetime national security, in which Saudi Arabia's collaboration in restricting the flow of oil was organized as though it were a system for protecting the oil against others. The second involved the rapid construction of lifestyles in the United States, organized around quite extraordinary levels of energy consumption, so that in the United States, even today, per capita oil consumption is roughly double that of any other industrialized country. In January 1948, James Forrestal, recently appointed as the country's first Secretary of Defense under the new National Security Act, discussed with the president of Mobil Oil how, quote, unless we had access to Middle East oil, American motor car companies would have to design a 4-cylinder motor car sometime within the next 5 years. In the following year, the US car companies helped by replacing standard 6-cylinder engines with the new V8s as the dream of every middle-class family. The new engineering of American cars engineered something larger than just an automobile. Carbon-heavy forms of middle-class American life that, combined with new political arrangements in the Middle East, would help the oil companies keep oil scarce enough to allow. If the ability of organized workers to disrupt the networks and nodal points of a coal-based energy system shaped the kinds of mass politics that emerged or threatened to emerge in the first half of the 20th century, this post-war reorganization of fossil fuel networks altered the energetics of democracy. The points of vulnerability where movements could organize and apply pressure now included a series of oil wells, pipelines, refineries, railways, docks, and shipping lanes across the Middle East. These became vital sites in the history of democratic politics. The details of some of these struggles are worth recalling. Iraq was the most important battlefield, for it had among the region's largest reserves of oil, but was the place where the international oil companies worked hardest to impede the expansion of supplies, delaying the building of pipelines, deliberately drilling shallow wells, plugging those that unexpectedly produced oil, and keeping secret through the 1960s the scale of the country's resources. Britain had reoccupied the country in 1941, less than a decade after granting the country nominal independence. Post-war protests there culminated in the popular uprising and student and worker strikes of 1948. The Communist Party of Iraq, one of the best organized political movements in the region, demanded, quote, the evacuation of foreign troops, the unshackling of democratic freedoms, and the provision of decent bread to the people. Hanna Batatu notes in his account that the party had, quote, concentrated the weight of its force in the colossal enterprises that were most vital to the country, the railways, the port of Basra, and the oil fields. This focus on the most vulnerable points in the technical structures of a petroleum-based system of production, quote, constituted the key to the party's basic strategy. In the railways, the party organized most of its resources at, quote, the most fundamental point in the entire system, the railway workshops at Shalshia, where the main stores and all repair and maintenance work were concentrated. Quote, stoppage of activity at this place for 10 to 15 days would have brought the movement of trains in the whole of Iraq to a complete standstill, unquote. In the British-controlled oil fields, the party focused its activities at an even more vital site, quote, the point of bifurcation of the Kirkuk, Haifa, and the Kirkuk-Tripoli pipelines, the K3 pumping station near Haditha. A strike by oil workers in June 1946 demanding the right to a union, sickness and disability insurance, and a pension was crushed by force, with 10 workers killed and 27 injured. During the 48 uprising, however, the oil workers succeeded in shutting down K3. Since the pumping station supplied the gasoline for other pumping stations, the union posted guards to ensure that not even a pint of gasoline got out. The stoppage lasted 2 weeks until the company surrounded the site with machine guns and armored cars and cut off supplies of food. Unable to risk an armed confrontation, the strikers decided to march on Baghdad, 250 kilometers away. After 3 days of marching and increasing support from the villagers along the way, they, quote, entered Fallujah and fell into a police trap. The oil workers were sent back to K3 and the strike leaders to prison. The other end of the Kirkuk-Haifa pipeline in Palestine provided another site of struggle. In the 36-39 Arab Revolt, the most sustained anti-colonial uprising against the British in the Middle East, a major target of the insurgency was the recently completed pipeline from Iraq. Initial efforts to weaken the British in August of 1936 by organizing a strike at the refinery at Haifa and at the port, the railway, and the Public Works Department were defeated when the British brought in Royal Navy engineers to run the trains and Jewish workers to run the port and the refinery. The pipeline was more vulnerable. Palestinian forces destroyed it for the first time near Irbid on the 15th of July 1936 and blew it up on 10 other occasions. Unable to protect the pipeline, the British created a force of armed Jewish settlers to assist with its defense, along with the protection of the Haifa-Lid railway. This British officered force became the nucleus of the Zionist army that seized control of Palestine in 1948. I'll skip some more examples. The book follows several other sets of connections, of examples of this, but also other kinds of connections, in which, in events such as these, the post-war relationship, I argue, on a global scale between oil and democracy was being engineered. Some of the other connections that it follows include the mechanisms that tied together democracy in the West, oil, and the movement of the US dollar, and the means of controlling the movement of finance. The relation between the rise of oil and the development of new forms of economic expertise, organized around an object that came to be called for the first time the economy in this middle period of the 20th century. Like 20th century democracy, 20th century economic expertise developed, in other words, in a specific relationship to the hydrocarbon age. Let me briefly sketch that part of the argument. This new object, the economy, which no one had thought to exist before the mid-20th century, was conceived in a particular way. It was not the total of the nation's wealth, something that had been proven impossible to calculate. There seemed to be no way to avoid continually counting everything twice, for example, when wholesale goods were resold at retail. It was imagined and measured rather simply as the phenomenon of banknotes changing hands. Even if it was the same money, every time it changed hands, it was measured as part of this new object called the economy. The economy was the sum total of those monetary transactions. This reconceptualization defined the main features of the new object. It could expand without getting physically bigger. Older ways of thinking about wealth were based upon physical processes that suggested limits to growth. The expansion of cities and factories, the colonial enlargement of territory, the accumulation of gold reserves, the growth of population, the absorption of migrants, the exploitation of new mineral reserves, increasing volumes of trade in commodities. All these were spatial and material processes that appeared to have physical limits. By the 1930s, many of those limits seemed to be approaching. Population growth in the West was leveling off. Colonial expansion of the US and European imperial powers had ended and was threatened with reversal. Coal mines were being exhausted, and agriculture and industry were facing gluts of overproduction. The economy, on the other hand, measured by the new calculative device of national income accounting, had no obvious limit. National income, later renamed GNP, was a measure not of the accumulation of wealth, but of the speed and frequency with which paper money changed hands. It could grow without any problem of physical or territorial limits. Oil contributed to the making of the economy as an object that could appear to grow without limit in two ways. First, oil declined continuously in price. Adjusting for inflation, the price of a barrel of oil in 1970 was less than half the price at which it sold in 1920. So although increasing quantities of energy were consumed, the cost of energy did not, before the 1970s, appear to represent a limit to growth. Second, thanks to its relative abundance and the ease of shipping it across oceans, oil could be treated as something inexhaustible. Its cost needed to include no calculation for the exhaustion of reserves. The growth of the economy had no need to account for the depletion of energy resources. Moreover, the costs of air pollution, environmental disaster, climate change, and other negative consequences of using these fossil fuels were not deducted from the measurement of the economy. Since this measurement made no distinction between beneficial and harmful costs, increased expenditure on the damage caused by fossil fuels appeared as an addition rather than as an impediment to growth. In all these ways, the availability and supply of oil contributed to the shaping of the economy and its growth as the new object of mid-20th century politics. The oil wells and pipelines of the Middle East and the political arrangements that were built with them helped make possible this idea of the Keynesian economy and the forms of democracy in which it played a central part. The book explores all that in detail and then relates that to also a history of finance, which I think is something that's the sort of the struggle to control the unregulated and speculative movement of international finance in the post-World War II period was something engineered through tying finance to the movement of oil, and the breakdown of that in the 1970s led to the explosive creation of speculative finance that is, of course, the object of our attentions in Wall Street and elsewhere today. Finally, one can follow the emergence of as other chapters of the book do, of a new partner to the oil-democracy nexus, apart from that of economic thought and finance. As oil revenues enabled countries like Iran and later Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states in the 60s and 70s to accumulate very large reserves of oil, US banking and manufacturing needed ways to recycle those funds. Ordinary consumer or capital purchases were insufficient because there was no way of people consuming things or building things fast enough to create enough demand for more, given the scale of oil revenues. The solution was to consume something different, to consume weapons. Arms are useful because they're useless. You don't buy them to use them up, so you can always buy more. And a small single item like a fighter jet could cost in those days tens of millions of dollars. All they needed was an apparatus of justification. An improvised speech by Richard Nixon on a visit to Southeast Asia in 1969, reiterating long-standing programs for arming local dictatorships, was transformed by groups like the Center for International and Strategic Studies, then housed here at Georgetown, into the Nixon Doctrine, to create the apparatus of justification for vast increases in arms sales, and that every subsequent account of the politics of this period dutifully refers to. University experts in security, in other words, did much of the rest. US and other Western's arms industry and related construction, consulting, and banking interests came to depend on the new flows of oil and finance that were consolidated either side of and during the 67 to 74 oil crisis. And these flows required new levels of militarism, indeed a US policy of prolonging and exacerbating local conflicts in the Middle East, and on what became its increasingly disjunctive relationship with the Salafist forms of Islam that I also explore in the book. Let me conclude. Understanding the contemporary politics of oil involves, I think, the difficult task of bringing together the sometimes raw violence that has been continuously unleashed to secure arrangements for the production of oil, in forms of spectacle or representation or expertise that seem somehow an equally effective aspect of the undemocratic politics of oil, not least the representation by experts of the US invasion of Iraq, or the organizing of Facebook workshops, or the continued military funding today for allegedly transitional military regimes as projects to bring democracy to the Middle East. I've tried to understand the question of oil and democracy by following closely the oil itself, not because the material properties or the strategic necessity of oil determine everything else. On the contrary, as I suggested, a lot of hard work went into producing America's strategic dependence on the control of the Middle East, starting with those V8 engines. But because in the building of a connected world of pipelines and pumping stations, refineries and shipping routes, road systems and automobile cultures, weapons experts and militarism, one discovers how a peculiar set of relations was engineered among oil, violence, finance, and expertise. And today, as the uprisings of the Arab world turn from a spring to a winter, we need to think in the kinds of ways I've tried to do here about how the flows of oil have set limits to democracy, here as well as there. The question is not one of better government policies, of more transparent arrangements of governments. As hydrocarbon rents flow till today to those who control the state, either directly or indirectly through other forms of revenues, the question is still today how to make those flows vulnerable. How do we compel the oligarchs who seek our consent to their rule to depend on the working lives of ordinary people to reproduce their own privilege and wealth? The relationships that I have been examining around oil are quite different from those of the coal age. If the emergence of mass politics in the early 20th century, out of which certain sites and episodes of modern welfare democracy were achieved, should be understood in relation to coal, I think the limits and openings of contemporary democratic politics, not only those of the Arab Spring, but those here, must be followed also in relation to oil. The possibility, in turn, of more democratic futures depends on the political tools with which we address the passing of the era of fossil fuels. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mitchell, for this very stimulating and energizing talk. Before I forget, we have some time for Q&A now, but there's also going to be a reception in ICC 241, and I invite you to join us there for some more conversations with Professor Mitchell as time permits. Now, we've set up 2 microphones, as you can tell, and I will simply ask you, if you don't mind, to state your name and affiliation and to keep your questions to the point so we can field as many as possible.
Can you hear me? No?
Almost.
The light is green. Is
There
that
we
better?
go.
Okay.
Yeah.
My name is Rochelle Davis, and I'm a professor
Hi.
in the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. Hi. I had a question. I've been working on issues of migration and immigration, and I was wondering if you could just, I'm sure you address it in the book, but if you could just sort of give us a hint as to some of the issues that you think about in terms of how both democracy and oil need us to get rid of borders, need us to have workers who need visas, but who can cross borders and who can either legally or illegally, and that whole flow of both labor as experts move across borders, as products and oil and those sorts of things move across borders. We also need workers to move across borders, et cetera. And so how much of this oil production is done by non-indigenous people? How much of this democracy work is done by non-indigenous people? I mean, you address this very much in your rule of experts and the bringing in of experts, but I think it also is coming at a whole nother level in the petroleum industry, where both the expert work and the grunt body labor is done by non-indigenous, people not of the country. I'm sorry, that was really kind of floaty and not very precise, but I hope it was clear.
It was, thank you. You want me to take each question as it comes? Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I take it on, this whole question of the sort of movement of populations in a variety of ways, partly by sort of folding the history of colonialism a little more into the history of coal, part of the story that I skipped today, because although there was this enormous concentration of energy around fossil fuels, it was equally dependent on a vast expansion of the use of solar energy, because you needed raw materials for the new forms of energy, and above all you needed cotton, and cotton actually required solar energy, needed sunshine rather than coal or oil, and so you needed vast movements of workers, including forms of slavery and so on, from early on. So there's many points in the argument where I'm trying to show how there are there's no one form of movement of manpower, as it were. And another point where it comes into the book in a sort of interesting way for me, I have quite an extended discussion of the 1905 Russian Revolution, originating in Baku. Baku at the beginning of the 20th century was the largest center of oil production in the world. It had surpassed Pennsylvania. In fact, it was producing half the world's oil. And it gives rise to workers' movements and, again, to the ability to shut down energy systems for interesting reasons, because, in fact, oil in Baku works like coal. It's actually used to drive steam engines and drive industry in the way that it isn't. So it's a sort of interesting transitional point where you have oil, but you have oil being used the way coal was being used. And it's a problem, and it has to be defeated. And one of the key ways in which the Russian authorities defeat the 1905 revolution is by exploiting the fact that there is an immigrant workforce there, a largely Persian workforce in the oil fields that has come either Persian-speaking or Azeri-speaking, that has come from what is today northern Iran. And a form of racial politics and pogroms emerges as the way to create the grounds for intervention and violence and so on, with which the workers' movements will be crushed. And it becomes that use of imported labor in oil becomes a sort of critical point, critical means of the development of the oil industry as it emerges to the south in Iran and Saudi Arabia in particular. So all that is there. I'm not sure that I can say any one thing about it. I think we now have a much better sense of the way in which the oil companies themselves drew on the practice of using imported labor forces and institutionalizing forms of racial division and hierarchy. And I think Bob Vitalis' work has been enormously important here, tracing that kind of use of racial difference that can be constructed around the importation of workforces and using it directly as a means of policing and suppressing and so on, right through the sort of period of the construction of the oil industry, and of course happening in other ways with the use of migrant labor forces today. Thank you. Hi there. I mean, that's a long age, and I think the points of vulnerability have shifted. And one of the things I look at in the book as I sort of trace the period from the 50s through to the 70s is, and I gave some brief anecdotes from that with the stories from Iraq and Palestine, actually back to the 1930s there. But one of the things I constantly try and trace is not only how those points of vulnerability emerge, but how the efforts and the measures used to either shut them down or convert them into something else. And so pertinent examples of that would be in the periods from sort of 44 to 51 in Iran, where you have a growing labor movement centered in the oil industry, whose demands for fairly radical forms of transformation in collective life in Iran are translated into a form of nationalism that is opposed to the foreign ownership of oil, but is not going to succumb to those kinds of broader political demands. And I think it's the ability to do that is not accidental. Because oil is the second major fossil fuel, it is located, in most cases, an awful long way away from where it's used, because the oil is used where the first fossil networks were built, in Northwest Europe and North America. And that very distance means that one has constructed these forms of colonial control over the oil, or imperial control over the oil, which means that, unlike with the coal industry in the West, you have that ability to translate a certain form of vulnerability into a nationalist claim that can turn it away from the demands for social transformation at home onto an antagonism towards a form of foreign ownership. I mean, the question of points of vulnerability, I've also briefly, in the sort of conclusion to the book, brought it a little more up to date. Most of the work is historical, and most of the detailed treatment in the book is on the period up through the 70s and 80s, from the beginning of the century, which already is enough. But I think it's very interesting to think about, I mean, I mentioned briefly at the beginning today, the ways in which a very particular pattern of oil earnings and declining oil earnings seems to be, is something one can trace in the countries of the uprisings of the Arab Spring. They didn't occur in the countries with very large oil earnings. They occurred, and they didn't occur in the 4 countries with no oil earnings, which are more or less organized around the Israel-Palestine question. They occurred in those with only a relatively small amount of oil, and they happen to be ones where the oil is running out and where earnings are declining. Egypt in 2008 or 9 became an importer of oil for the first time almost in its history, almost in the 20th century, except for a brief period in the 1960s. So I think some of the financial and economic vulnerability that underlies those uprisings can be traced in relation to movements of oil. Though I've also been interested in ways, I mean, this is one doesn't have to trace these only in relation to oil, in ways in which, given that vulnerability partly related to oil, regimes in a case such as Egypt became vulnerable to a kind of labor organizing that some of our colleagues have documented in detail, that I think can be traced specifically to the failures of earlier attempts at neoliberal restructuring and the need to turn that restructuring to areas like textile manufacturing and areas like tax collecting where that had previously been left alone. So I think this sort of rather detailed attempt to understand where a regime, where a political structure becomes vulnerable can be done not only in terms of movements of energy, but in the forms of manufacturing or the flows of revenue that are attached to it. So that's, you know, I think your question, a proper answer to your question is something more than I can take on. It's what I can point to is sort of ways, I think, of thinking about the importance in addressing the question of how to construct more democratic, more egalitarian worlds of not thinking about democratic procedures so much as procedures for vulnerability, for how to engineer into the power of the oligarchs who are going to rule us and who are going to seek our consent, even if they're going to seek it through democratic forms, how to engineer into that in very specific ways, methods that force them to become vulnerable to those who through whose lives, through whose well-being we would like them to have to produce their forms of privilege.
Sure. Sam Shahata, I teach here at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. I think you've addressed, to some extent, the question that I was going to ask, which was your very provocative remarks at the beginning of your talk, in which you said you linked the Arab uprisings with the states that had declining oil revenue. So I wanted to push you on that, you could kind of expand on that, but you've done that to some extent. And of course, to also say that there have been protests quite significant in states that have large amounts of oil. And in fact, there have also been quite conscious efforts by those regimes to take preemptive measures that continue each day to try to ward off those kinds of protests. So I wanted to ask about that. The other question was a historic question, and I simply don't know that much about. But you said at the beginning, or in the middle of the talk, with the example of Venezuela, there was a conscious effort to locate oil refinery facilities away or outside of these oil-producing states. And I'm wondering to what extent that was a political calculation in one sense, and to what extent, in the case of the Arab Gulf, for example, it had to do with simply technical expertise and those kinds of logic. In other words, what kind of logic was behind that? Thank you.
Thanks, Samir. I mean, there was always a sort of technical argument that could be made about the routes of pipelines or the location of refineries. But what's interesting when one sort of begins to look at the negotiations and the calculations going on is to discover how much was at stake. I mean, for example, there's no technical reason why the TAP line from eastern Saudi Arabia ended up on the shores of southern Lebanon. In fact, the closest point was for it to reach the coast of Palestine. And the original plans were for it to terminate at Haifa. And of course, things were developing in Palestine that raised questions about that. Not just a situation of political conflict, actually, but just a sort of a mobilized workforce that was already creating, as I mentioned, this series of problems for the British with their refinery on the pipeline coming from Iraq. But then, if they weren't going to go to Palestine, the obvious thing was to go south and end up on the northern coast of Sinai. But they didn't want to do that because one of the things they had to engineer with the routes of the pipelines was the global financial order. And the global financial order, as I sort of alluded to, was being based on flows of oil because it was the one thing everybody had to buy. And in the effort to build a post-war financial order based not on gold but on the US dollar, the Bretton Woods system, the critical thing was producing this thing of dollar oil. And most of the oil in the Middle East previously was in British hands prior to the development of the American industry, particularly in Saudi Arabia. The point was to have dollar oil coming out of the Middle East. If you build your refinery or your transshipment point on the coast of British-ruled Egypt, you're in the sterling era and you've got sterling oil, and you can't do that. So yes, there are technical questions, but the political questions, even at the level of constructing a global financial order out of Bretton Woods, are at stake in these kinds of issues. The standard history of oil in the Middle East, of course, always wants to begin with Winston Churchill, the prize, the term that, the claim that Jürgen takes his famous book on the history of oil from. Churchill is the first historian of the oil industry because after World War I he has to justify the entirely undemocratic structure he's given to British control of Iranian oil. So he writes a history of what he did in the pre-war period in the decisions over British ownership of Anglo-Persian oil, what became BP. And every other historian just seems to take that account at face value, including the need for that oil and for the sort of technical dimensions of the conversion of the Navy to oil and so on. The Navy was already converted to oil before Churchill took that decision, and Britain already had much more secure supplies of oil potentially. In Mexico, most of Mexican oil was in British hands prior to World War I. The problem with the oil of Iran was that there was absolutely nothing to do with it. It was useless. It was technically useless because it had a high sulfur content, and they couldn't find anyone to sell it to. And they built their refinery on an island, the island of Abadan. But having done so and having sunk some money into it, there was absolutely nothing to do with it. The Indian government absolutely refused to take it to run its trains on. Nobody wanted it as kerosene, which was the major use of oil. So that sort of technical history is there and is in the book. But it's not a kind of technical determinism the way sort of Churchill gives it to you as this sort of march of the progress of technology. It's a lot about failures and detours and roundabouts and things of that sort.
Sir.
I was able... Hello? Can you hear me? Okay. I was able to read the article version of this argument. Unfortunately, did not have access to the book. but one of the sections that I found to be the most provocative was your section on arms sales and increased militarism. I thought that to be one of the clearest examples of this idea of how a kind of economy can lead to a sort of behavior in political and international relations that leads to the cementing or solidification of a particular kind of government in the Middle East. The class that I was able to read your article for, in that class we focus on this question of the persistence of authoritarianism in the Middle East. And so I read your article with that in mind, and I found one section to be puzzling, and I was hoping you could discuss it further.
Okay.
There was an area where you made this argument that in the West, post-war democracy relied very much on, or needed, financial stability, and that financial stability then grew out of, or perhaps even required, the kinds of economy that used pipelines and that for which oil was the lifeblood.
Yeah.
But I was wondering, why did it have to be post-war democracy? Why wasn't the response of governments to coal workers that were unruly more along the lines of what you would see in an autocratic state? Why didn't it lead to autocratization instead of democratization or strengthening of democratic institutions? Why was autocracy exported to the Middle East? You know, why was it acceptable then to have authoritarian regimes there so we could have democratic regimes here? If you could expand on that, that would be wonderful, and talk about you know, why it is that, I don't know also if the notion that oil is more easily controlled through authoritarianism than democratization, and certainly the Arab Spring brings that into question. Thank you.
Thanks. It was not inevitably the case that those struggles in Europe led down a more democratic path rather than a more authoritarian path. And of course, there's places, Germany, Italy, Spain, and so on, where the threat of democracy, the threat of successful egalitarian claims, led the right to overthrow democratic political systems. And those kinds of things could have happened again. There's no simple line between having some coal and having some democracy. There's rather a complex story that you can trace. All I'm saying is that if you take the coal seriously, you can trace it better than if you ignore it. And if you take the oil seriously, you can trace one of the particular ways in which it was limited. And I'd also stress that because yes, democracy was rebuilt in post-war Europe. There was an enormous struggle about what that democracy was going to be, and particularly as a result of sort of sacrifices in the war, there was a very real sense that it had to be something different than the limited forms of pre-war democracy. And at the heart of that were things like demands for worker control of industry or shares in the management of industry, ownership, shares in ownership, and so on. Those tended to take forms that didn't work out so well, or they never went ahead. They're forced out of power. That's a question that I don't think I can give a sort of sweeping answer to, but really just to point to the need to follow the kinds of connections that I make. I mean, to give you an example of the way that happens, in the 1960s, of course, there's a resurgence of democratic politics in Europe, and leading to the European Spring of 1968, and the great effort to sort of revitalize demands for a more democratic society. One of the great theorists in France of that new kind of sort of democratic energy, who plays a key role as a theoretician, as an activist in 68, is a sociologist by the name of Serge Mallet, who has written a book called The New Working Class, published in the early 60s, that tried to identify what it was that was enabling the working class in Europe to become more assertive, more powerful, and ultimately to lead to the uprisings of '68, May of '68. And to understand that, he did research, like Sama does, on the factory floor, which I wish I could have done. And the place he chooses to do it is not a factory, but an oil refinery on the west coast of France. And what he identifies there is the emergence of new possibilities of labor activism based on the new forms of industrial processing that an oil refinery and associated petrochemical works represents. Because what he says is that workers have now become, as it were, managers of the flow of chemicals and of other kinds of technical processes. And that means their ability to sabotage, a word that goes back to the history of labor organizing in the coal industry and the railway industry, the early 20th century. What sabotage means has changed, because you now have this technical control over complex chemical and physical processes that you can actually, the sort of go slow, the work to rule is actually the movement of these chemicals through apparatuses and things like that. And so workers can do that, and that makes them more powerful, less vulnerable. They don't have to lose wages by undertaking forms of industrial action. And he traces that whole history. What he doesn't tell you is that refinery was the end point of the tap line, of this pipeline I mentioned that's being built to weaken democratic politics in Europe. It was the Aramco refinery for Europe, owned by Texaco, that was bombed during the war and then rebuilt with Marshall Plan funds as part of the same scheme of de-democratizing Europe by moving from coal to oil. So at that kind of level, I can answer your question. And I think it's a fascinating sort of history. But I can't necessarily answer it on a broader, more schematic way.
Should we take 2 minutes?
Yeah, happy to take as many as you want.
Please do identify yourself.
I'm Ryan Weber, and I guess unaffiliated. Professor Mitchell, I just have kind of a general question. You've talked a lot about the divergent and similar characteristics of the coal and oil and how those particular energy networks led to these different narrowing or opening up of opportunities for democracy or political action. My curiosity is, as we look, as you say, at an age of oil or an age of carbon that has its own ends sewn into it in certain ways, as we look forward beyond that, as we look to a post-carbon age, what takeaways do you see in terms of networks of oil, in terms of junctions of production, in terms of junction of production of energy more broadly? So my question is, while this is carbon democracy, I wonder to what extent it happens when we take the carbon out of the equation.
Well, first, Ryan, I have to thank you because I referred to Baku, and the fact that I was alerted to the significance of Baku to my story is thanks to Ryan Weber, who did his MA thesis with me and wrote a brilliant thesis on the history of the oil industry in Baku that I derived many insights from, and there I was talking about it and not even acknowledging you 5 minutes ago, so thank you for that. Post-carbon. You know, the sort of interesting arguments one sees about this. Greenpeace in Europe, I believe, argues that if we all go off-grid, it'll be democratizing. If we all put solar panels on our roofs and build wind turbines and disconnect ourselves from electrical systems, from networked, grid-based sources of energy, it'll break the power of large energy companies, of oil companies and other things on whom we're all dependent, and out of that will emerge a sort of more small-scale, more autonomous forms of political life. Others say no, it's the opposite. If we install our solar energy systems not on the roofs of our houses, but right across the Sahara, on a vast scale, and these are solar systems that run turbines rather than photovoltaic systems, and generate electricity and then build these circum-Mediterranean electrical networks, will all become so networked together, so integrated, that conflict in the Mediterranean region will have to disappear because we're all tied together and dependent on one another's energy systems. So, I think one can argue these things in lots of different ways, and I don't have any one answer to them. I think what to me is interesting about them is that awareness that in the building of energy systems, you are involved in a process of socio-technical engineering. You're building forms of collective future, and therefore when one makes decisions about subsidizing solar energy or building vast new transmission systems, one is building a future form of collective life, and that's how we should be discussing and thinking about our own collective and political futures, rather than saying, oh, well, if we just do it that way, then everything's going to be fine. I don't think there is any one simple answer to that. Simply sort of opening up that way of thinking about the political seems to me the most important thing one can do at this point. Yep, sure.
Hi, I'm Rania Suez. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the Center for Arab Studies, and I'm also an anthropologist of Egypt. And Professor Mitchell, thank you so much for being here and presenting your research.
Thank you.
At the start of your talk, you spoke about the manufacturing of a particular kind of political subject. And so I'm hoping you can just speak a little bit more about the process of democratization and the work involved in producing this kind of political subject. I specifically want to know who are the actors involved in the process of manufacturing subjectivity, and what are their ethics and logics? Thank you.
None of those small questions. You know, I don't think I can answer the question in the terms you posed it. I can more just point, as I've tried to here, into a way of thinking about that question. And let me say a little bit more about that. So, you know, what interested me in thinking about the ways in which histories of democracy in the Middle East were tied into histories of democracy in the West, if one thought about them in terms of histories of coal and oil and so on, is that the business of making democratic claims, or the ability to make democratic claims, came to appear less and less as a problem of sort of consciousness or having the right culture or being trained in the right forms of liberal subjecthood, and more about this technical process of being able to construct forms of collective agency that were not just about sort of clubs and societies and parties and other kinds of things, but were put together out of things that were technical and material as much as human and cultural or forms of consciousness. And if one wants to think about constructing contemporary forms of political subjectivity, subjecthood in contexts like the Arab Spring, what that points to is, you know, abandoning the kinds of approaches that are about, you know, have people got the right kind of cultural equipment to do this kind of thing, which is what dominates, of course, Western political discourse. And instead, and that's what I was sort of raising questions about in these projects like the Internet 2.0 and Facebook organizing, or about barometer projects that were about attempting to locate, not just locate, but actually to engineer these forms of connected subjectivity. And the criticism was not that they were attempting to engineer this, but in sort of looking towards this engineering work, they were missing out so much of what it is that has engineered vulnerability in the past. I mean, let me give you another sort of very simple example. I mean, this question of oil is always talked about, as I said at the beginning, as sort of the question of rent. Oil is this vast surplus income that accrues as rent in the technical economic sense of a sort of surplus that is just there to buy people off. You know, in the post-war period, period of post-war construction in the Middle East and also in East Asia, there was a very real awareness of the problem of rent as a problem for new forms of politics. It wasn't oil rents, it was rents in the original sense, landowners. And in order to engineer more egalitarian societies, it was understood that what you had to do was take away the land from the landowners and deal with the problem of rents through the organizing of new kinds of relations between those who grow the food and those who grow the land. And that was done very effectively in East Asia, where they were terrified of communist revolutions, and in a very, very limited way in the Arab world. But it was understood that it had to be a sort of a very practical issue of who, not just in legal but in practical terms, who owns that crop when it comes out of the ground, and how is that ownership organized, and so on. And that's what land reform was about. So, I think without realizing, we sort of had a certain kind of understanding of the engineering of forms of political agency through programs like that seems to be lost today in the language of transparency and that kind of sort of liberal talk about governance and so on. And whether one's thinking about land or oil or other sources of revenue, it's that more technical dimension of things that I'm trying to think about. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, thank you all. Just a few words before we move to the reception and honor Professor Mitchell in ICC 241. I just wanted to thank you for your questions, for attending. I want to also thank the staff of the center for all their help in making this event possible, especially Maggie Daher, our public affairs coordinator. Thank you. And once again, thanks very much for Professor Mitchell for coming here and giving us such a great talk.
Thanks very much. That was wonderful.